"You're not getting on this plane, hon, and I suggest you step aside before you embarrass yourself any further." The words came from a broad-shouldered man in a captain's uniform, 4 gold stripes gleaming under the fluorescent lights of Gate M12. His arms folded across his chest, like a door that had already decided to stay closed. He did not lower his voice. He did not look away. He said it the way men like him always say things, with the absolute, unquestioned certainty of someone who has never once been told he was wrong. Behind him, the jet bridge stretched empty, and waiting the plane already loaded the boarding nearly complete. In front of him stood a woman in a simple navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a clean bun, a single carry-on bag at her feet, and a boarding pass displayed clearly on the phone in her hand. Business class. Seat 14B. Her name on the ticket, her face on the ID, her credit card that paid for it 3 weeks ago. Everything in order. Everything legitimate. She did not step aside. She went completely still, not the stillness of someone who is afraid, but the stillness of someone who is deciding how much rope to give a man before he runs out of it himself. Around her, the passengers who had been waiting in the economy line had stopped talking. Phones were rising, slowly held low, but angled toward the confrontation with the instinct people have now, when they sense that something historic is about to happen, and they want to be the ones who captured it. Captain Roy Dalton looked at her, the way he had looked at 100 people before her, the slow, dismissive appraisal that started at the top and moved down and landed nowhere kind. He took in her dark skin. He took in her simple clothes. He took in the absence of an entourage, a designer bag, a first-class attitude that he would have recognized and respected. He found none of those things, and so he found her wanting. I said. "Step aside," he repeated, and his voice had dropped into something quieter and more dangerous, the way a man's voice does when he thinks he has already won. The woman looked at him for a long moment, just looked at him, steady and unhurried. And then she said, in a voice so calm, it was almost a different language from the one he was speaking, "You seem to have me confused with someone who can be denied." Dalton laughed. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound, the laugh of a man who has just heard something he considers beneath a response. He had no idea, not even the beginning of an idea, that he was not just blocking a passenger from a jet bridge. He was standing in the path of the woman who owned every single plane behind him, and the laugh that came out of his mouth in that moment would be the last confident sound he would make for a very long time. At 5:40 that morning, Elena Vance had stood in front of the bathroom mirror of her room at the airport Marriott and done something she had not done in years. She had taken her time. Not because she was vain. Elena Vance had not been vain a day in her adult life. She took her time because she was about to walk into a situation that required her to be seen as nothing, and there was a particular kind of discipline in that, in deliberately making yourself invisible when you were the most powerful person in the building. She reached into the side pocket of her carry-on and found the small velvet pouch that went everywhere she went, and she took out the pearl earrings, simple ivory, slightly yellowed with age, and she put them on. They had belonged to her mother, Dorothy Vance, who had worn them every single day of her working life through 31 years as a hospital administrator in Birmingham, Alabama, rising from filing clerk to the woman who ran the whole building, one quiet, determined step at a time. Dorothy Vance had told her daughter many things, but the one that had stayed longest, the one that lived in Elena's chest like a second heartbeat, was this: a black woman in this country has to be twice as ready just to get in the room, and then 3 times as good once she's there. Elena had spent 30 years trying to prove that wrong. She had spent 30 years discovering over and over again that her mother was right. She had fixed a broken freight shipping company in her 40s, turned it from a company hemorrhaging $40 million a year into the most efficient logistics operation on the East Coast. Then, she had taken on a failing hospital network in the Midwest, where the board had been skeptical and the staff had been exhausted and the patients had been underserved, and she had spent 3 years rebuilding it from the inside out. One department at a time, earning trust the only way she knew how. By showing up, paying attention, and refusing to leave until the work was done. Meridian Airways was different. Meridian was bigger, older, and sicker in ways that went beyond the financial reports. The board had brought her in. Not unanimously, she knew that she had been told that 2 members had voted against her, specifically because she lacked aviation industry experience, which was a polite way of saying they did not believe someone like her could understand something as serious as an airline, and they had given her a mandate. Fix the culture, stop the bleeding, save the brand. She had said yes, and she had meant it. And her first official act as CEO of Meridian Airways was not a press conference or a town hall or a lavish introduction ceremony at headquarters. It was this: she booked a commercial flight under her own name on one of the airline's most underperforming routes, with a ticket purchased on her personal credit card, and she came to the airport alone. No assistant, no security detail, no announcement. She wanted to see the airline the way her passengers saw it, unfiltered, unpolished, exactly as it was. She had arrived at gate M12 with her leather notebook. Her mother's notebook, the same battered black journal Dorothy had carried to work every day for the last decade of her life, and she had sat down in the crowded gate area and begun to write. The carpet near the boarding door was frayed along one edge, a small thing, the kind of thing that gets ignored when everyone is too busy to notice. The delay board showed a 20-minute postponement with no explanation posted. One of the 2 gate agents, a young woman named Patrice, according to her badge, looked like she had been on shift for too many hours without enough support. The other agent, an older man, was making announcements into the microphone with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been given bad news to deliver and no tools to deliver it kindly. And then there was the pilot, standing near the jet bridge door with his co-pilot laughing at something with the relaxed authority of a man who considered this territory his own. He had his captain's jacket draped over a nearby chair, like a king who has set aside his crown because he knows it will still be there when he wants it. He was not worried about the delay. He was not looking at his passengers. He was performing the role of man in charge for an audience of one which was himself. Elena had written 2 lines in her notebook, and then the boarding call had come, and she had joined the short queue for business class, and she had been 3rd in line, and the first 2 passengers had boarded without incident. And then it was her turn, and Roy Dalton had stepped into her path, and the audit had begun ahead of schedule. He moved before she even reached the scanner, a deliberate, practiced step that put his body between her and the jet bridge, with the ease of a man who had done this before. Perhaps not exactly this, but something close enough that the motion came naturally. His eyes moved over her slowly, and it was not a security check. The way security checks are supposed to work, quick and professional and equal. It was a judgment, the kind that starts with an assumption and works backward to find evidence. And the assumption was already made before she had spoken a single word. Hawni said again, and the word landed the way he intended it, to small and dismissive the verbal equivalent of a hand waving away something unimportant. We're going to need you to step out of this line. Is there a problem with my ticket? She asked. There's a problem, he said loud enough for the passengers behind her to hear, with me believing it's your ticket. The implication was not subtle. He did not make it subtle. He let it sit in the air of the gate area like something he was proud of, and the passengers near the front of the economy line shifted uncomfortably because they had heard it too and understood exactly what it meant. Elena did not react to the word he had not said. She held up her phone with the boarding pass displayed and said simply, "Scan it." He did not scan it. He put his hand on the scanner, not scanning, just covering it, and turned to Patrice at the gate podium. "Call security," he said. "This passenger is being disruptive." Patrice looked at Elena. Elena was standing perfectly still, both hands visible, her voice level, her face composed. She was the least disruptive person in the gate area. Patrice knew this. She looked at her radio. She looked at Captain Dalton. Her hands had begun to tremble in a way she was trying very hard to hide. She had seen him do this before, not exactly this, but the shape of it was familiar, the way he positioned himself as authority and dared anyone to question it. 18 months ago, there had been a black businessman in 3A who had eventually just picked up his bag and walked away rather than fight. Nobody had filed a report. Patrice had thought about it for 3 days and then told herself it wasn't her place. She picked up the radio. Dalton, emboldened, leaned slightly toward Elena and lowered his voice to the register that is designed to humiliate without witnesses, though there were plenty of witnesses, and at least 2 of them had their phone cameras running. "I know what you're doing," he said, and his voice had a cold, pleased quality to it now. "And sweetheart, it doesn't work on me. I've been flying 27 years, and my gut tells me things that paperwork can't. And right now, my gut is telling me you do not belong in my cabin." Elena held his gaze without blinking. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She simply stood there and let every word he said become part of the record, because she had already understood, from the moment he stepped in front of that scanner, that this man was not making a mistake. He was making a choice, and she was going to make sure that choice had consequences he had not imagined. She said nothing. She waited, and her silence in that moment was the most powerful thing in Gate M12. The 2 airport police officers arrived with the brisk professional efficiency of people who have seen every kind of gate dispute and expect this to be another one, a misunderstanding about seats, a overbooked row, someone with too much carry-on and too little patience. What they found instead was something that made the male officer slow his stride, almost imperceptibly, as he assessed the scene. A black woman standing perfectly still, with her documents in her hand, and a 4-stripe airline captain with his arms folded and his jaw set, and the specific posture of a man who has decided he is the wronged party before anyone has asked him a question. "What's the trouble here?" the male officer asked, directing the question to the air between them. Dalton stepped forward immediately, the way men do when they are certain the authority in the room belongs to them. He introduced himself with his full title, his years of service, his position as pilot in command, and then he described Elena with a series of words that were chosen very carefully. Erratic, agitated, suspicious behavior. Words that had nothing to do with what was actually happening, but everything to do with a coded language that Dalton had learned over 27 years, could be used to make people doubt what their own eyes were seeing. "My gut," he said, and there was a practiced solemnity to the phrase, as though he were invoking something sacred. "My 27 years of experience tells me she is a threat to the safety of 200 passengers, and I will not put those lives at risk." The female officer turned to Elena. Elena presented her driver's license, her boarding pass, and the credit card she had used to purchase the ticket. She stated her name clearly. She described without editorial or emotion exactly what had occurred from the moment she stepped into the boarding line. She did not call Dalton a racist. She simply described what he had done in sequence and let the description speak. The officers looked at each other with the microscopic communication of partners who have worked together long enough to read each other across a crowded room. They ran her name. No warrants, no flags. The ticket was paid and confirmed. She was by every measure available to them exactly what she said. She was a valid passenger being prevented from boarding by a man who had not offered a single legitimate reason. But they could not force a captain to fly. Federal regulations gave Dalton final authority over his aircraft, and he knew it, and he was using it the way a person uses a legal technicality, not because it is right, but because it is available. Then Dalton leaned in, dropping his voice to the register he had used before, the one designed for ears only, and he said the words that no amount of backtracking would ever unsay, that she was not the kind that belonged in his cabin, that this wasn't a community outreach program, that she was Raf, who had no place in a seat she hadn't earned. And he used the word sweetheart again, like a period at the end of a sentence. Patrice heard it. Her face changed in a way she could not control, a small, involuntary flinch, like someone who has touched something and burned their hand and cannot pretend they didn't feel it. James Webb, the co-pilot who had been standing near the jet bridge door, watching the entire confrontation with growing horror, finally moved. He stepped forward, put his hand briefly on Dalton's arm, and said in a low, reasonable voice that they should just look at the ticket, that they were already late, that this could be resolved in 30 seconds if they would simply scan the boarding pass. Dalton turned on him with a speed and venom that startled the passengers close enough to see it. He removed Webb's hand from his arm with a deliberate, contemptuous motion and told him that he was a co-pilot and he would speak when spoken to, and that this was Dalton's leg and his ship and his command, and Webb had better remember where he stood on that hierarchy before he embarrassed himself. He jabbed a finger at Webb's chest once sharp, and Webb recoiled his face, flushing with anger and humiliation. He stepped back. He did not forget a single thing he had just witnessed, and Elena, who had been watching all of it, had written a name in her mind beside the word promote. Patrice Nguyen had worked Gate M12 for 4 years, and in those 4 years, she had developed the particular skill of making herself small in Roy Dalton's presence. Not because she was naturally small, she was not. She was a person with opinions and instincts and a genuine love for the job she did, but because she had learned the way people learn things that are never written in any manual, that drawing attention to yourself around Roy Dalton was a transaction with a very poor return. She had watched him for 4 years. She had watched him make small, precise cuts at people who could not fight back a too long pause before helping a passenger who didn't look the way he thought passengers should look. A comment murmured just under the threshold of reportable a way of folding his arms and setting his jaw that communicated without words that certain people were on probation for existing in a space he considered his own. She had watched, and she had filed it in the part of her mind where people store things they have decided not to act on because the cost of acting on them seems too high. 18 months ago, she had almost filed a report. There had been a man in 3A, a black businessman in a beautiful gray suit, and Dalton had done to him a version of what he was doing now. Smaller, but the same shape. And the man had eventually looked at his watch, and looked at his bag, and looked at the gate agent, which was Patrice, with eyes that said, "I have been here before, and I know how this ends," and he had picked up his things and walked away. No scene. No confrontation. Just the quiet, practiced surrender of someone who has learned that the fight costs more than the flight. Patrice had gone home that night and thought about it for 3 days. She had a sick mother. She had a lease. She had a manager who thought Dalton was a bit old-fashioned, but one of the best. She had told herself it wasn't that bad, and that she hadn't really seen what she thought she saw, and that filing a report would accomplish nothing except putting a target on her own back. And so she had filed it in that same mental drawer and closed it and kept working. But Elena Vance was not walking away. And something about that, something about the quality of Elena's stillness, the way she stood there without flinching and without surrendering and without performing distress for an audience, made the drawer in Patrice's mind slide open again, and everything she had put in it come flooding back. She picked up her radio. Dalton was watching her. She pressed the button. "Gate M12 to Central," she said, and she was careful about every word that came next. She did not say disruptive passenger. She did not use the code Dalton had wanted her to use. She said, "We have a dispute at Gate M12, requesting security." And she set the radio down. It was a small thing. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was the first honest thing she had said out loud in 4 years at this gate. And in her chest, beneath the fear, something shifted. Something that felt uncomfortably and unmistakably like the first movement of a conscience that had been held still for too long. She looked at her hands on the podium keyboard and thought, when someone asks me later what I did, what am I going to say? Elena had given Roy Dalton every opportunity that patience and dignity allow. She had presented her documents. She had stated her case clearly and without theatrics. She had allowed the police officers their process. She had stood still while he used language that was designed to make her feel like less than what she was, and she had not given him the satisfaction of a reaction, because she understood. She had understood, from the moment he put his hand on that scanner, that a man like Roy Dalton relies on. Reaction feeds. On it uses it to justify whatever he has already decided to do. So she had not reacted. She had waited. And now, she was done waiting. She reached into her bag and took out her phone, not hurriedly, not dramatically, with the same measured deliberateness with which she did everything, and she dialed a number from memory. No scrolling. No searching. She knew this number the way she knew her own address. "Who are you calling?" "Dalton," said, and there was a new note in his voice. Not quite worry, yet, but something adjacent to it, the first small crack in the certainty. Elena looked at him steadily. "The person who is going to relieve you of this situation," she said. And then the call connected, and she turned her attention to the phone. She identified herself. She gave the gate number, the flight number, and the name of the pilot causing the delay. She said clearly and without embellishment that she needed Frank Okafor at gate M12 in 4 minutes, with a replacement captain and the head of airport security. She said she also needed the union rep for the Midwest hub contacted, because there was going to be a termination, and she wanted it done correctly. Then she said, "Thank you," and she ended the call. 4 minutes. The gate area was absolutely silent. Dalton's face had gone through a quick sequence of expressions: contempt, then amusement, then something that was not quite the absence of amusement, but was close, and he opened his mouth to say something dismissive about lawyers and trespassing. But the words did not come, because Patrice had made a sound. It was a small sound, barely a sound at all, something between a gasp and a whisper, and Dalton turned toward it, and found Patrice staring at her computer screen, with the expression of a person who has just understood something terrible and irreversible. Patrice had been running Elena's name through the system from the beginning of the confrontation standard procedure, she had told herself. Just verifying the ticket, and the verification had returned the booking confirmation, which she already knew was valid. But then her muscle memory had carried her one step further into the internal company directory, and she had typed the name Elena Vance, and the directory had returned a result. And that result had taken her to an internal company-wide email sent 3 days ago, and the email had a subject line and a photograph. The subject line read, "Meridian Airways proudly welcomes our new chief executive officer." The photograph showed a woman in a simple, elegant navy pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, pearl earrings, a composed and direct expression. And Patrice looked at the photograph, and she looked at the woman standing 3 feet from her podium, and she looked at the photograph again, and she turned the monitor around slowly, the way a person moves when they are no longer certain their legs are working properly. Dalton looked at the screen. He read the name under the photograph. He read the title beneath the name. He read it again. His face did what faces do in the moment after a world ends. It went completely, utterly still, the blood leaving it in a tide that had nowhere to go. Elena did not smile. She did not say, "I told you so," or "Look at that," or anything that would have been satisfying and small. She looked at her watch, a plain, practical watch, nothing ostentatious, and she said 4 words in a voice that was quieter than anything she had said in the last 40 minutes. "Your 4 minutes are running." Frank Okafor did not run. Running would have been undignified, and Frank Okafor was a man who understood the relationship between dignity and authority in a way that Dalton never had, that authority does not need to perform itself, does not need to shout or posture or fill the room with the sound of itself, because real authority simply arrives and the room rearranges around it. But he moved with a controlled urgency that made the passengers in the concourse instinctively step aside, because something in his velocity communicated that this was not routine, and the 2 junior executives behind him in their meridian blue suits were practically running to keep up with a man who was walking. He reached gate M12 and took in the scene. In 2 seconds, Elena standing to the left of the podium, calm and composed. Dalton to the right, already diminished in a way that had nothing to do with anything Frank had done yet. Patrice at the podium, with a face that had been through a great deal in the last 15 minutes. The police officers hanging back with the specific relief of people who are about to be released from a situation above their pay grade. Frank went to Elena first. Not to Dalton, not to the officers, not to the gate agent, to Elena. And that choice, that simple directional choice, communicated more than anything he could have said, and Dalton saw it and understood what it meant. Elena gave Frank a single nod. "I'm fine, handle it." Frank turned to Dalton. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform the outrage he clearly felt, because performing it would have given Dalton something to push against, and Frank had no interest in giving Roy Dalton anything at all. Instead, he recited in the flat, precise tone of a man reading from a document that has already been written what had occurred in gate M12 in the last 37 minutes. He named each action. He named each word that had been reported to him on the phone. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. Dalton tried the union. Frank told him the union's position would become very clear once they watched the recording. Dalton tried seniority. Frank said, "Roy, your seniority ended approximately 6 minutes ago, when you decided to use the word riff-raff in front of a gate full of passengers and 2 police officers." And then Elena spoke, and this time she spoke at length because she was no longer a passenger defending her right to board. She was the chief executive officer of Meridian Airways, addressing an employee who had just conducted himself in a way that would define the next chapter of this company's history one way or another. She named what had happened without softening it, without wrapping it in the language of misunderstanding or regret or isolated incident. She said that Dalton had looked at a black woman with a valid ticket, and his first assumption had been fraud, not customer, and that he had used the machinery of his authority, the safety language, the security call, the physical blocking of the gate, to enforce a prejudice that had no place in her airline. She said that she had heard with her own ears the specific words he had whispered, when he thought only she and Patrice could hear, and that those words were now part of the record. Then she turned to James Webb. Webb, who had been standing to the side with the careful stillness of a man who is hoping to remain invisible, looked up when she said his name, and his eyes had the expression of someone who is not sure whether what is happening is real. "First Officer Webb," Elena said. "How long have you been a first officer?" 7 years, ma'am," he said. 4 of them on the 777. "Are you rated to command this aircraft?" "Yes, ma'am. I have my captain's certification." He paused, and something crossed his face, a flicker of something complicated. "I haven't been promoted yet." Elena looked at him for a moment, just long enough for him to understand that she already knew why that Frank had pulled his file in the 4 minutes between her phone call and his arrival, and that she knew about the 3 blocked promotion recommendations and the 2 performance reviews that had been mysteriously downgraded, and the year Webb had spent flying the worst routes in the Midwest, while younger, less qualified pilots moved past him. "Congratulations, Captain Webb," she said. This is your aircraft. Get in that cockpit and get these people to London." Webb stared at her. He looked at Frank, who nodded once. He looked at Dalton, who was no longer looking at anyone who had found a point on the floor somewhere near his own feet, and was studying it with the intensity of a man trying to disappear into it. And then James Webb did something that no one in Gate M12 would forget. He straightened visibly and completely the way a person does when they shed something they have been carrying for a long time. And he walked past Roy Dalton without a word or a look, and he disappeared down the jet bridge toward the cockpit. And when he was gone, the space he had occupied felt entirely different. Lighter and cleaner, as though something that had been wrong for a long time had just been corrected. 2 Meridian security guards materialized at Dalton's flanks. They were large, expressionless, and utterly professional. They said simply, "Mr. Dalton, please come with us." And Roy Dalton, who had spent 27 years being the most powerful person at any gate he stood in front of, looked at Elena one last time. And what was in his face was not rage anymore. It was something rawer and more honest, a kind of baffled incomprehension that said he still even now could not fully understand how the world had rearranged itself so completely in under 40 minutes. "You," he said, and stopped. There were no more words. "Yes," Elena said. "Me." Frank read the suspension formally in the precise language that the company's legal team had already drafted and transmitted to his phone in the 3 minutes since Elena's call, because Frank Okafor was the kind of man who anticipated and prepared and never arrived anywhere without what he needed. Gross misconduct, passenger endangerment, violation of the company's ethics code, conduct unbecoming of a representative of Meridian Airways. Dalton went through 3 stages in the space of about 90 seconds, and the passengers who were close enough to see it would describe it differently. Afterward, some said he looked angry, some said he looked lost. One elderly man near the front of the economy line would tell his daughter that night that the pilot looked like a person who had walked confidently through a door and found there was no floor on the other side. First came the rage, the threatened roar about the union, about his record, about 27 years of service, about what his lawyer was going to do about this, about entrapment and conspiracy, and the rights of a pilot in command, all of it coming out in a rush that was less like argument and more like a man emptying his pockets to find something valuable and coming up with nothing. Then came the bargaining, quieter, more desperate, directed at Frank rather than Elena, because Dalton understood instinctively that Frank was the door he might still be able to open, that Elena was already closed to him, and he talked about his record and his family and the 30 years he had given to this industry, and whether any of that counted for anything. Frank listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has already decided and is simply waiting for the other person to finish. And then the silence came, the particular silence of a man who has finally run out of things to say and is standing in the ruins of everything he built on sand. Elena did not speak to him again. She had said what needed to be said, and she was not interested in adding to it. When the security guards escorted him out, they did not take him through the main terminal. They took him through a service corridor that ran behind the gates, a narrow fluorescent-lit passage used for cargo carts and maintenance crews, the invisible infrastructure of an airport that the passengers never see. It was in its way the most precise possible consequence. The man who had spent decades performing his authority in the most visible spaces available was now being removed through the part of the building that nobody looks at. The gate area exhaled. It wasn't a cheer exactly, more like a collective release of something that had been held too tight for too long. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the economy line, a single person began to clap, and then another. And then it spread the way those things spread, when people have been watching something they needed to see and are finally allowed to respond to it. An elderly white woman near the front of the line, 70 years old. If she was a day, her silver hair perfectly set, a carry-on bag on her lap that she had been clutching through the entire confrontation, reached out and touched Elena's arm as Elena passed. Just touched it briefly. She did not say a word. She just looked at Elena with eyes that had seen a great deal of life, and she nodded once slowly, with a kind of recognition that went beyond the specific and into the universal. That small gesture, that one touch from a stranger who had nothing to gain from it, would stay with Elena longer than anything Roy Dalton had said. She turned to face them all, not just the business class passengers, not just the people who had been close enough to hear every word, but all of them, the families and the solo travelers and the people in the back of the economy line who had only caught glimpses of what happened and were still piecing it together. And she spoke to them the way she had always wished someone would speak to her when she was the person watching from the outside, plainly, directly, without the corporate hedging that turns an apology into a non-apology and a promise into a press release. She said her name. She said that she was the new CEO of Meridian Airways and that what they had just witnessed was real and wrong and would not be minimized or explained away or described as an isolated misunderstanding. She said that the captain who had refused to let her board was no longer employed by the company. She said their flight would depart in 15 minutes with a new pilot in command, and that she was personally sorry for the delay and for the ugliness they had been made to witness. And then she turned to Patrice. The gate area went quiet again because everyone could see that this moment was different from the others. Not an execution, not a triumph, but something more complicated and more human. Patrice, Elena said, and her voice was not cold, and it was not kind. In the easy, forgiving way, it was the voice of someone who is telling the truth, because that is the only thing worth offering. I know that what happened here tonight put you in an impossible position, and I know that you have been in impossible positions before in this job with that man, and that nobody ever gave you the tools or the support to handle them the right way. Patrice was gripping the edge of the podium. You made a choice tonight that protected him, Elena continued. And you made one small choice that didn't. I noticed both. She paused. You are not fired. But we are not finished. When I land in London, I am going to call you personally, and we are going to talk about what it means to work for the airline that I intend to build, because the gate agent is the first human face this company shows to the world. And I need the people in that role to be braver than the culture they've been given permission to be. Patrice's face crumpled. Not the way faces crumple from fear, but the way they crumple from something that does not have a clean name, something between relief and shame, and the particular grief of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told for the first time that someone sees it. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together and nodded once very firmly and held on. Elena picked up her carry-on, walked to the scanner, held out her boarding pass, and the machine beeped green. The applause that followed her down the jet bridge was the warmest sound she had heard in a very long time. The flight attendants at the door of the 777 were standing with the particular rigid composure of people who have prepared themselves for the worst and are not entirely sure the worst is over. They had heard everything the intercom at the jet bridge carries more than most passengers realize, and they had spent the last 20 minutes doing their jobs with the mechanical efficiency of people who are operating on adrenaline and prayer. The senior purser was Margaret O'Say, 61 years old, 23 years with Meridian, a woman whose face had the quality of someone who has been through enough that very little surprises her anymore, though tonight had tested that quality significantly. When Elena stepped through the door, Margaret looked at her, and something happened in that look that was not professional deference and was not the terror that the younger attendants were still wearing on their faces. It was recognition. The specific unspoken recognition of two women who have spent their careers moving through spaces where the rules were written before they arrived, and who have both developed out of necessity the same particular kind of steadiness. "Welcome aboard," Ms. Vance Margaret said. Margaret Elena replied, reading her name tag and offering the first genuine smile she had given anyone in the last hour. "Please just run the flight exactly as you normally would. I want to see what Meridian looks like when it's working." She found her seat 14B window exactly as ticketed and settled in and opened her mother's notebook. Not to the page where she had been writing her observations before the confrontation, but to the beginning, from the top, reading back through the small, careful notes she had made about the frayed carpet and the unmanned delay board and the overworked gate agents. She wrote beneath each one in the margin a number her triage system, 1 through 5, urgency of attention required. The carpet was a 3, the staffing was a 2, the communication gap was a 1, and then she wrote at the bottom of that first page a name she had not yet assigned a number, because the number did not exist in her system, yet she would need to create a new category for it. Roy Dalton, 11 years of complaints buried. The boarding door closed, the cabin settled, and then the intercom chimed, and a voice came through. Not the boom that the regular passengers on this route had grown accustomed to, but a steadier, quieter sound, slightly nervous in the best possible way, the way a person sounds when they are doing something that matters for the first time, and they understand the weight of it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain James Webb. Welcome aboard Meridian Flight 112, service to London Heathrow. I want to begin by apologizing for our delay tonight and thanking you for your extraordinary patience. We have a flight time of 7 hours and 42 minutes. Conditions over the Atlantic are smooth, and it is my personal commitment to get you to London safely and as comfortably as I possibly can. Thank you for flying with us. It was simple. It was honest. It was perfect." Elena looked out the window as the plane began its pushback from the gate. Across the tarmac in the thin late evening light, she could see the shape of a man in a captain's uniform walking beside a security vehicle, carrying his own bag, his jacket over his arm. The gold stripes on the sleeve were invisible at this distance. He was just a man walking away from something he had lost. She watched until the plane turned and he disappeared from view. Then she closed her notebook, pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window, and let herself feel for one private moment that belonged entirely to her the full weight of what this night had been. The anger of it, the exhaustion of it, the grief of being someone who has to fight battles that should not exist. And also underneath all of that, something quieter and more enduring, the knowledge that she had not moved. She had stood still, and the world had rearranged itself around her. Then she straightened, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and went back to work. The Atlantic at night is a different kind of dark than any dark on land. A vastness that puts everything human into proportion. And at the midpoint of the crossing, when the cabin had gone quiet, and most of the passengers were asleep under their blankets, with their screens dark and their seats reclined, Margaret Osei came to seat 14B with a glass of water and a look that said she had been deciding something for a long time, and had finally decided it. "Ms. Vance," she said softly, "I'm sorry to disturb you." Elena closed her laptop. "Margaret, please sit." Margaret sat in the empty aisle seat across from her, and for a moment she just held the glass of water with both hands, the way a person holds something when they are not sure how to begin, and then she began. She told Elena about Roy Dalton, not the Roy Dalton of tonight, the one who would be on every news channel by morning, but the Roy Dalton of 6 years of Tuesday flights and Friday overnights and gate-to-gate schedules that she had shared with him, while quietly cataloging the ways he made people small. She told her about the black family he had found a reason to downgrade from the seats they had paid for, and the reason he gave was medical. He had said the father seemed unwell, which was a lie. The father was perfectly fine, and the downgrade had been arranged before the family even boarded. She told her about the young female flight attendant, whose complaint about Dalton had been reviewed and marked unfounded within 48 hours, and who had been assigned to the worst routes for the following 6 months, the 5 a.m. departures, the single-stop regionals, the flights nobody wanted, until she had transferred to another carrier and been better for it. She told Elena what they called him in the break room. King Roy. Said without affection, without irony, just the flat resignation of people who have given a name to something they cannot change. We filed reports, Margaret said, and her voice had a quality in it that Elena recognized the sound of a person who needs to be believed, who has been not believed before. We did everything we were supposed to do, multiple times, different people, different years, and every time nothing happened. The reports would go up to management and come back down, as resolved informally or under review, and then just disappear. And he would still be there on Monday morning, large as life, untouched. Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Atlantic was invisible and immense. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question. Margaret looked at her hands. Because she said slowly, the way a person chooses words. When the words matter, you are the first person who ever came through that gate with enough power to do something about it, and used it for someone who had none. You didn't calculate it. You didn't wait to see which way it would land. You just stood there. And that's something I've been watching for a long time, waiting for someone to do. Elena was quiet for longer this time. The plane hummed around them steady and enormous, carrying 200 people through the dark, over water, and she sat with the weight of what Margaret had just given her, not information, though it was that too, but testimony, the kind that costs something to give. "Margaret," she said. "Finally. I'm going to land in London and go straight to my laptop, and I'm going to pull every complaint ever filed against Roy Dalton. Every single one. And I'm going to find every manager who read those complaints and did nothing. And I'm going to hold them accountable in the same way I am holding him accountable. Not because it makes good press, because it is what the word accountable actually means." Margaret nodded once carefully, like a person setting down something fragile. "Get some rest," Elena said gently. "You have done something brave tonight." Margaret stood, paused for just a moment, and said, "So did you, Miss Vance. You did it first." She went back to her galley. Elena opened her notebook and turned to a new page, and at the top of it, she wrote 2 words, "Find them." And then beneath that, smaller in the handwriting that was her mother's first and hers second, she wrote, "And then fix what let them hide." Flight 112 landed at London Heathrow with 12 minutes to spare, a textbook landing that Captain James Webb executed with the careful, concentrated precision of a man who understands that this flight, of all the flights he will ever make, is the one that defines what kind of pilot he is. His final announcement to the cabin was 3 sentences. Thank you for flying with them. He hoped the journey had been as comfortable as he could make it, and he wished them well wherever they were going. And it was so direct and warm and human that the passengers responded with something that began as applause and turned briefly into something closer, to a cheer, the sound of people who have been through an unusual evening and are grateful to have arrived. Elena was the last one off. She stopped at the cockpit door, and Webb stood up when he heard her, and they looked at each other in the small, close quarters of a cockpit that smelled like coffee and recycled air and the specific electricity of a long flight just completed. "You did a fine job, Captain," she said. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, and his voice was full of something he was trying to manage. I just did what I was trained to do. You did more than that. You stepped up when it mattered, and you didn't let what he did to you tonight make you smaller." She paused. "The field promotion is permanent. Frank will have the paperwork to HR before you land back in Chicago, and your pay is retroactive to last night." Webb was silent for long enough that she could see him working to keep his composure, and she looked away briefly to give him the privacy of the moment. "The only advice I'll give you," she said, "is the same advice the best mentor I ever had gave me on the first day I had real authority. Protect the people in your care, and the rest takes care of itself." She walked into the terminal, and her phone began, not buzzing, erupting. The specific, relentless vibration of a device being overwhelmed by incoming information from too many directions at once. A passenger from row 22 named Kenji Tanaka had uploaded his video before the wheels touched the runway. He had been filming from the moment Dalton stepped in front of the scanner, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Of footage, steady-handed, clear audio, nothing missing. The clip showed everything, the slow, dismissive appraisal, the words, "Not your kind," Elena's stillness, Webb's attempt at de-escalation, and Dalton's public humiliation of him. The arrival of Frank Okafor, the escort through the service corridor, the gate erupting into applause. The internet had given the video a title before Meridian's communications team had even woken up. "Pilot refuses black woman boarding. She's his new boss." 2.1 million views in the first 3 hours. And climbing. She found a quiet corner of the Heathrow Executive Lounge, ordered a black coffee, and called her head of communications, a woman named Dana, who had worked with Elena for 6 years and had the specific unflappability of someone who has watched her boss walk into impossible rooms and walk back out again with the furniture rearranged. Elena Donna said, and she did not say good morning because it was not that kind of morning. "The board is losing its mind. The union filed a grievance 40 minutes ago. Legal wants you to say nothing. And the story is already on 3 television networks," I know Elena said. "I'm going to need you to take down what I'm about to say and have it posted in 2 hours." "Elena, take it down, Dana." There was a brief pause and then the sound of a keyboard. "Ready." Elena dictated the statement standing by the window, watching a Meridian 777 taxi toward a runway in the gray London morning, and she did not soften a word of it. She named what happened. She did not call it an isolated incident, because it was not an isolated incident. She called it what it was, a failure that had been building for years in a culture that protected the wrong people, and she described specifically and publicly what she was going to do about it. The complaint files, she was pulling the managers who were going to be held responsible. The new training protocols she was commissioning, the whistleblower protections she was putting in place before the end of the week. She ended the statement with one sentence that she hadn't planned that came to her as she was speaking, looking at the Meridian plane on the tarmac. The old Meridian had plenty of room for people who looked the part. The new Meridian has room for everyone who deserves to be there, which is every single one of you, Elena Donna said when she had finished. "The lawyers are going to have heart attacks." "Send it," Elena said. "And Dana, tell them the legal review is a courtesy. I'm the CEO. I've already decided." She hung up, drank the coffee, and called Arthur Keene the chairman of the board. Arthur was a man who expressed anxiety through volume, and he was very anxious. He talked about the stock price, which had dropped 9% in pre-market trading, and the union threat, and the media cycle, and the liability questions, and Elena listened to all of it without interrupting, because she had learned a long time ago that people need to empty themselves of their panic before they can hear anything useful. When he finished, she said, "Arthur, the stock dropped because people saw a Meridian captain discriminate against a black woman in front of 200 witnesses and a phone camera. My statement explains that I was the black woman. It explains what I'm going to do about it. In 48 hours, you are going to have a very different stock story. "You can't know that," Arthur said. "I know it," she said, "because I know what people respond to, and people respond to a leader who owns what happened and tells them exactly how she is going to fix it. What they don't respond to is a corporate statement that says, 'We take all matters of discrimination very seriously,' and announces an internal investigation that takes 18 months and concludes nothing." There was a long silence. "Fix it," Arthur said finally, and hung up. She looked at her watch. She had been awake for 26 hours. She ordered another coffee and opened her laptop and got to work. Frank Okafor had not slept. By the time Elena's statement went live, Frank had been in the Meridian Operations Center for 9 hours, and the complaint file on Roy Dalton was no longer a file, it had become a box, and then 2 boxes, and then a rolling cart that someone had dragged in from the storage room because the table was full. 19 formal complaints over 11 years. Flight attendants, passengers. One junior pilot who had filed a report and been told his concerns were noted, and then watched his schedule quietly deteriorate for 6 months before he transferred to a regional carrier in the Pacific Northwest and never came back. The complaints were detailed, specific, and consistent, the same patterns repeated across 11 years, with the same man at the center of everyone. Every single complaint had been reviewed by one of 4 managers. Every single one had been marked unfounded or resolved informally, or most often simply never followed up on after an initial acknowledgement email that said the matter was being taken seriously. The managers had names, and the names were now on a list on Frank's laptop, and the list was not long, which made it worse, not better. It meant that the same small group of people had been making the same decision for over a decade. They were summoned that morning, not fired, not yet, but brought into a room where the boxes sat on the table, and told to sit down, and asked in the patient, careful way that Frank asked things when he was most serious, to explain one complaint at a time, what they had done, and why. The union's grievance lasted approximately 4 hours. Dalton's union rep had been confident and aggressive when he filed it, citing unlawful termination and lack of due process, and Elena's legal team had been ready for him with the cart of boxes and a copy of the video and the affidavits that Margaret and 2 other flight attendants had already provided. And by early afternoon, the grievance had been withdrawn without comment, because there is no way to argue in public for the reinstatement of a man who said "not your kind" on camera to his own CEO. Dalton was on his own. Elena's team filed the FAA complaint, not under the umbrella of discrimination, because that was a different and slower process, but under safety, arguing that a pilot who could not assess a situation without the filter of his own personal prejudice, who had fabricated a safety concern to enforce a racial bias, who had dismissed his co-pilot's reasonable de-escalation attempt and escalated instead, that pilot represented a genuine and documented risk to the passengers and crew under his command. The FAA investigation took 90 days. The ruling was 4 pages long, and its conclusion was not ambiguous. Roy Dalton's airline transport pilot certificate was permanently revoked. He could not fly for Meridian. He could not fly for any carrier. He could not fly at all. The 4 gold stripes, the captain's authority, the my aircraft, my command, that had been the entire architecture of his identity for 27 years, gone. Completely and permanently gone. A note in the final HR report, added 6 months later, recorded that Roy Dalton had accepted a position with a ground handling company at a regional airport 60 miles outside of Chicago. He loaded freight. He stood on the tarmac in all weather and moved other people's luggage from carts to conveyor belts, while Meridian planes taxied past him on their way to runways he would never see from the inside again. The gold stripes were gone. He was just a man in a yellow vest watching the sky. 3 weeks after the incident, Patrice Nguyen sat in a small conference room on the 14th floor of Meridian's Chicago headquarters in a chair that was slightly too big for her, across a table from Elena Vance, and she held her hands in her lap and waited for what she had told herself on the train ride over was probably going to be the end of her career. Elena set a folder on the table. "I reviewed your personnel file," she said, "and I reviewed the security camera transcript from gate M12. Patrice nodded and braced. "What I found," Elena continued, "was that in the 4 minutes between Captain Dalton's first refusal and the arrival of the security officers, you made 2 radio calls. The first was the call he asked you to make. The second, and I want to make sure you know that I know this was different. You described the situation accurately. You did not use the code he wanted. You said dispute, not disruptive passenger. You reported what was actually happening." Patrice looked at her. "I didn't think anyone would," she began and stopped. "It was a small thing," Elena said. "I know that. You know that. But it was an honest thing in a moment when dishonesty would have been easier and safer, and that matters to me." She opened the folder. "You are not being terminated, Patrice, but I want to talk to you about what happens next." What happened next was this: Elena offered her an assignment. Work with the training department to write a new protocol for gate agents, specifically for situations where the aggressor is not the passenger, but the crew member, where the power dynamic is reversed from what the training manual assumes, where a gate agent is standing between a bully in uniform and a passenger with no recourse. It would be called the M12 protocol internally, and it would be built from Patrice's specific experience, because Patrice knew exactly what it felt like to be in that position and have no playbook for it. Patrice walked out of the building with a purpose she had not walked in with. She took the train back to O'Hare. She worked her shift at gate M12, which had new carpet now, and a third agent at the podium, and a signage system that actually updated in real time. 2 months later, a different supervisor. Not Roy Dalton, never. Roy Dalton again began questioning a young black girl in seat 2, a teenager flying alone for the first time, her boarding pass valid, and her hands wrapped around a backpack strap, and her eyes going carefully neutral in the way that kids learn to go neutral when adults start making them prove they belong somewhere. Patrice picked up her radio before the supervisor had finished his second sentence. She pressed the button. She said clearly, and on record, her voice steady, in a way it had not been 3 months ago at this same gate. "The passenger in 2A is cleared. Her ticket is valid. Please let her board." There was a pause. The supervisor looked at her. She looked back at him and did not look away. The girl boarded. It was a Sunday morning in March when Elena called Margaret Osei, not an email, not a message through HR, a direct call at 9:15, while Margaret was standing in her kitchen in her housecoat, drinking tea, and looking out at the bare-limbed tree in her backyard that would in another few weeks have leaves again. She picked up and heard Elena's voice, and in the 7 months since that night over the Atlantic, she had thought about their conversation many times, had replayed it the way you replay things that changed something in you. But she had not expected the call to lead where it led. Elena told her she was being promoted to Director of In-Flight Experience for Meridian's entire transatlantic operation. She told her the promotion carried a salary she named, and that the role had been created specifically because the airline needed someone to rebuild the in-flight culture from the inside out, and that the person who did that work needed to have spent 23 years in the cabin, not 6 months in a headquarters conference room. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The tree in her backyard had a bird on one of the branches, small and brown, and absolutely still. "Elena," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about that night?" "Goddamn M12, I mean. The flight." There was a brief pause. "I think about the hour before it," Elena said. "I think about sitting in that gate area, watching the carpet fray, and the board not update, and the agents running on empty, and thinking that this was what the airline felt like from the outside, and understanding that if it felt this way to me, it felt this way to every single person who flew with us. I think about how ordinary it looked. Another pause. The scandal wasn't that night, Margaret. The scandal was every ordinary day before it that nobody stopped. Margaret set down her tea. The bird on the branch outside was gone. She didn't see it. Leave it was just gone. I'll take the job, she said. She opened her laptop the next morning and began to write the first page of a new in-flight culture guide, a document that would eventually run to 40 pages and be read by every Meridian flight attendant hired in the following 3 years. And the first line of that document read, "Every passenger who boards this aircraft is already where they belong. Your job, our job, is to make sure they feel it." 8 months after that night at Gate M. 12. James Webb stood at the entrance to the jet bridge and did not move. Behind him, the gate was full, families, business travelers, a school group in matching t-shirts, the usual cheerful chaos of people about to go somewhere. The gate agents were staffed to 3, the signage was current, the carpet was new, the delay board showed an on-time departure. The gate area looked the way a gate area looks when someone has been paying attention to it. Webb was looking at the spot where Dalton had stood. Not with anger he had found over the last 8 months, that the anger had given way to something else, a kind of clarity about what the job was supposed to be and what he intended to make it. He stood there for just a moment, long enough to let the memory of that night settle into its proper place, not as something that diminished him, but as something that had ultimately required him to become exactly the person he had always intended to be. Captain Thorne, the gate agent. A young man on his 3rd week looked over at him with a question in his face. Webb looked around the gate at the new carpet, the 3rd agent, the updated board, all the small, careful changes that had accumulated in 8 months under a CEO who believed that the visible surface of an airline is the truest statement of its values, and he nodded. "Everything's fine," he said. "Let's get these people home." He walked down the jet bridge. In his breast pocket, folded once along a clean crease, was a piece of Meridian letterhead slightly worn now from being folded and unfolded, from being held on the bad days and set aside on the good ones. Elena's handwriting at the top. His name. Effective immediately in recognition of 7 years of exceptional service and the character demonstrated on the night of he had the date memorized. Her signature at the bottom, clear and without flourish, the signature of a person who means exactly what she signs. He would carry it on every flight. He had not told anyone this. He did not need to explain it to anyone. It was between him and the document, and the woman who had written it, and that was enough. 1 year after that night, Elena Vance boarded Flight 112 again. Same route, same gate. Seat 14B. She had booked it the same way she booked the first one. Her own name, her own card. No announcement, but this time, when she arrived at gate M12, the agent at the podium looked up and said her name warmly, and meant it, and the other passengers who recognized her nodded or smiled, or in one case, an older man with a newspaper tucked under his arm simply raised his coffee cup in a small, silent salute. She settled into 14B and opened her mother's notebook, the same battered journal, the spine more worn now, the pages fuller, and she read back from the beginning. The frayed carpet crossed off replaced October. The delay board crossed off real-time updates implemented system-wide. The gate staffing crossed off 3-agent standard, now mandatory for international departures. The overworked agents crossed off new scheduling review completed. She turned pages. Item by item, the list that she had written on the worst night she had had in years had become 12 months later a record of things that had changed, and the record was long. The last item on the list was not a system or a policy. It was a name. Roy Dalton, unchecked for 11 years. She read it and she held it for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has looked at a hard truth long enough to understand its full shape. And then she drew a single line through it and turned to a new page. Beside her was an empty window seat, because she had switched seats with the passenger who had been assigned it, a girl maybe 11, flying with her grandmother for the first time, who had pressed her face to the glass the moment she sat down and had not moved since. The girl's grandmother had thanked Elena in a whisper. Elena had shaken her head and said very simply that she remembered what it was like. She sat back and watched the girl watch the world outside the window, the tarmac, the other planes, the enormous ordinary miracle of an airport doing its work. And she thought about her mother, Dorothy Vance, who had first taken her on an airplane when she was 9 years old, a summer trip to Washington, D.C., to see the monuments, and who had given her the window seat and sat in the middle and watched her daughter's face instead of the view, and who had said, when Chicago had fallen away below them and the sky had opened up, "Baby, always take the window seat if you can. The world looks so different from up here." The plane began to move. Over the intercom, steady and warm, and carrying the ease of a man who has found his place, Captain James Webb welcomed them aboard, gave them their flight, time wished them well, and meant every word. Elena opened her pen. She turned to the fresh page. She did not write anything yet. She just looked out the window as Chicago fell away below the grid of streets, the silver thread of the river, the whole vast, ordinary, complicated life of a city, going about its business without knowing it was being observed. And she felt for the first time in a long time the particular lightness that comes not from having finished, but from understanding exactly what comes next. The plane leveled off. The city was gone. The sky was wide and very blue. She began to write. A man in a yellow safety vest stood on the edge of a tarmac in the first cold of November, watching a Meridian 777 rotate off the runway and climb into the gray morning sky. And he knew the tail number. The way he used to know all of them, had known them the way. You know, the faces of people who work for you. And he watched it until it was a silver shape against the clouds, and then smaller, and then gone. And he was still there on the ground, holding a cargo manifest in a hand that had once worn 4 gold stripes. Flight 112. Departed gate M12. On time for the 312th consecutive day, and the passengers who boarded that evening moved through a gate that was fully staffed and clearly signed with a departure board that was accurate to the minute, and agents who made eye contact and used names and gave directions without sighing. And none of them knew why this particular gate ran the way it ran, and that was exactly as it should be, because the measure of a thing that has been fixed is that it no longer needs explaining. It simply works, and the people who use it simply feel, without quite knowing, why that they are being taken care of. Somewhere over the Atlantic at 38,000 feet in seat 14B, a woman had a notebook open on her tray table and a pen in her hand, and the whole dark winter sky outside the window, and she was writing the next list because there is always a next list, and the list is never finished, and that is not a failure. That is the work, the real work, the kind that does not end when the headlines do. And she had chosen it freely, and she would choose it again. And her mother's pearls were in her ears, and the plane flew on. If you believe every person deserves to walk through the door, they paid for subscribe to our channel and never miss a story like this one.